Haven't even started with Nodirbek playing the mind games.
Looks like he's ready for that chess boxing match, but this will all be settled on the chessboard. Wesley, no more B3 cowboy for him. He's back to his king pawn opening.
But which king pawn opening will it be? No more Scotch game, which led to that disaster in Game 3. It's back to the Italian, maybe inspired by Fabiano Caruana's success in this opening against Magnus Carlsen. And Black's knight comes out, the two knights defense here against the Italian. Provocative stuff. And look at Wesley. He was eyeballing his opponent there, and he goes in, hoping for the fried liver attack. What will we see? Black's knight dodges. There was a poison pawn in the centre. We see a quick trade, but this is a pawn sacrifice from Nodirbek Abdusattorov.
And not one. It can be, I was going to say, another pawn can be given up if the queen moves up to f3, but a different opening approach. He does retreat with the bishop. The fried liver attack, it promises to have madness on the board very, very early on. What do you think is going to happen? Who is better prepared here, Robert, in this opening right now?
Well, Nodirbek wasn't expecting it. I don't think. He's pausing, he's calculating. And these players, they study their fellow top players' games. Knight g4 jumping out. The knight on g5 is not protected, so that knight likely has to move away from its current square. But what I was going to say is that they study their fellow competitors' games, and Hikaru Nakamura has played the white side of this position many times in important battles. So Wesley, he moves his knight away. It's going to be a real sharp game because Black has given up a pawn, but White's moving those minor pieces numerous times at this stage.
And he's got to move them some more because very often in these positions, Black marches up the board with that f-pawn. It's all about trying to create play, compensation, piece play for that sacrificed pawn. f5 is on the cards. And David, it can happen now.
It can happen now. It most likely will happen now. One thing I should mention is that 2 years ago on the Champions Chess Tour, Wesley So was playing this quite consistently. He even played this variation with the bishop back to d3 against Magnus Carlsen and got a huge advantage. Wesley So created a chessable course in 2021, and it was about this variation. We talk about the top players doing their research, and wow, f5 on the board, a quick flurry, some knights disappearing. Black going for the white king. The f2 pawn now is a big, big target. Who cares about the pawn structure, which is crazy? Black is a pawn down, but he's going on the attack.
Clearly, Nodirbek doesn't care about his pawn structure. That is the strangest pawn formation I've seen on the board. We are on move 12, and look at Black's pawns.
I would never play in this fashion with either color. It looks too risky. Black is currently a pawn down, but there are so many open files and diagonals. You see that dark square bishop that just developed. It's staring at the f2 pawn, the golden pawn, right in front of the white king. White is not castling kingside in this position, not when the h file is also opening up. So Wesley needs to be extremely precise. I actually think that Wesley, if he goes wrong, he could be losing in just a few turns. But if Nodirbek doesn't know how to continue here and keep this initiative, he is down a pawn after all, and the rest of his pawn structure is shattered.
Look at Wesley's body language here. He was shaking his head quite noticeably for a while, then a bit of a kind of brush of the brow there. Now he's just nervously looking at his position, eyeballing his opponent there. He is flummoxed. This was a surprise. Knight to g4, it's a known move, but it very rarely happens at the top level. And if you haven't researched this recently, if you haven't refreshed your mind, haven't looked at what the computer suggests here, as Robert says, it could be knockout within a few moves. You have to be super accurate here. You're treading a fine line as white. He brings his knight out. As far as I know, one of the main moves. And how deeply does Nodirbek know this position?
And that's the big question. Wesley is the first one to spring a surprise with knight to g5, the fried liver attack. But Nodirbek counter-surprises Wesley with his own knight a couple of moves later, jumping on to g4, getting this absolute chaotic position. Wesley makes a developing move. The e4 pawn currently hanging. Also so much tension on the king side with the h-line open. Black's rook pinned behind the h5 pawn.
Strategically, Black's in terrible shape, right? He goes queen d4, checkmate in one is threatened. Now Wesley castles, and his next move, if f2 doesn't come under any more fire, he wants to push his pawn up to d3 and develop his dark square bishop. He desperately needs to get more pieces into the defense. Now after the castle, kingside, the f2 pawn is hanging once more. Queen e1, slide that queen over, bring all of your pieces defending the pawn, and only then push your pawn to d3. I think Wesley knows this quite well.
Yeah, Wesley pausing, but he does eventually play the only move in that position, the key move, sliding across, defending stuff with his queen. And earlier, Robert, you name-dropped Eric Rose in the Stafford Gambit. This looks like a variation of the Stafford Gambit. It looks like white is about to get checkmated, But if you hold things together long term, it is worth suffering for. You do have extra material potentially. You do have all those targets. So it's all about this initial storm. If white survives, most likely Wesley will win long term. If not, we might see a quick miniature finish. Abdusattorov pausing here. Slight surprise that he's pausing because he was the one who initiated this craziness by throwing the black knight to g4. Surely he knows what's going on with black, and it is up his alley. It is his style. He's looking away. Maybe he's just choosing between two promising moves here, and eventually he takes the pawn. So level material yet again, but it's all the double pawns, isolated pawns in the world for black, and it does give white the time to play your move, Robert.
But the ugliest pawn structure I think we've ever seen. Like, there are two sets of double isolated pawns on E file and G file. Then we have the isolated A and C pawn. So it's really a hideous structure for black. But after D3, which was necessary from white, you can take this pawn on D3. And in the very near future, there is going to be G4 to G3 exploiting the pin on this dark square diagonal. Maybe you can play Rook takes F2 first even, just to trade even more pieces. Rook takes F2 would be met by G3. And white escapes. You can see the eval bar still hanging towards the center, but black's getting rid of that really horrendous pawn structure.
Yeah, and there we go. He starts trading off just before it's too late. I wanted to highlight this pawn structure. One isolated pawn, two isolated pawns, doubled isolated pawns, doubled isolated pawns. Yeah, long term, this is suffering for black, so do not try it at home unless you know you're going to land a killer attack. He does trade off, and moment of truth. Wesley pauses. Will he take back with the pawn, the bishop, or will he drop his own bishop in? I don't think he should actually go for this one because black would sacrifice the queen. And here it's too much material. One bishop will fall. Yes, the queen disappears. But a rook will fall with check. And it's more about counting here, more about the maths. Bishop, bishop, and rook for the queen. Too much material.
Wesley continues with his head shake, not happy with the opening outcome. And I wonder if that has something to do with the position that we have, or the fact that he was expecting Nodirbek to be surprised by his opening choice, but Nodirbek, on the other hand, continues to blitz out the moves. And now he's got to show more in this position. Does he go for the sacrifice on F2? Because you have to be quick. Long term, Nodirbek doesn't survive this one. Rook takes pawn. Is that the only way to go forward?
I would definitely be playing with that in mind because I want to liquidate and get rid of my double isolated pawns. The problem for Nodirbek is even once the pieces come off, there's still enough firepower left to go after black's remaining pawns. They're all spread out. It's like bowling. You never want to split. You never want pawns split like this. Oof, this feels really not fun for Nodirbek, and he's now spending some time here because he wants to figure out, do I trade off pieces or do I have something in this position going after the white king?
We keep saying that it's not fun for Nodirbek, but there's only one guy on our screen shaking his head, and it's Wesley So. And what's going on in his mind? Because the position looks defended for Wesley, but awful for black. And we see Nodirbek is in with rook takes pawn. Why is Wesley constantly shaking his head in this opening?
We've seen Wesley's recent tweets or his posts on X. We've seen him in interviews. He's trolling people. It's a red herring. I don't think Nodirbek should read too much into the body language here. If Wesley didn't know what was going on, he would have spent 10 minutes, not just 2-3 minutes. So Wesley's just trying to recall everything. Maybe if he's shaking his head, it's just about the fact that he didn't kind of check this line recently. He hasn't analysed it with the latest engines, or not in the last few months at least. But rook takes pawns on the board, fireworks. Wesley has to defend accurately. But is he going to take this rook back with his own rook or with the queen? That's the first question. Queen's on or off the board as Nodirbek stretches, looking confident.
He's flexing, right? He's showing that he's worked out. He's just getting in those what are the traps. And so you see that rook takes F2. It's setting up a bit of a trap because black does want to push this pawn to G3 and go after the pin. And look at this decision from Wesley. He gets all the pieces off the board. I get the feeling he still knows what he's doing. He may be shaking his head, grabbing his face, all that stuff. I really think that Wesley has studied this position and he might even have more lines to go.
Perhaps the head shake is because he realizes that Nodirbek also knows exactly what he's doing, because it feels like he's managed to equalize the position. At least that's what the bar says. It's easy for us to say, but once again, the position doesn't look as easy as it looks. And for now, he at least delays taking that F2 pawn, the umbrella pawn, as you call it, Robert, which keeps white's king safe so far in the position, not opening up the F line for the black rook to slide over.
Yeah, it feels like one of those openings, and this is very common in modern chess, especially at the top level. It feels like a line where You test your opponent, you've both done the clicking, you've both checked the engine, what the top moves are. You have to remember it, of course, but if you both remember, the game does fizzle out towards a balanced position. But white is the one testing black right now. Yes, black's got an extra pawn, but black's pawn's still ugly. I'm expecting Wesley to continue, after a bit more thought, to kind of develop his pieces. Once the white bishop, dark square bishop, and rook are into the game, we will see a roughly level endgame here.
And let's remind everyone, it's a best of 2. So this is Wesley's only white in this match. So perhaps just a bit disappointed that he didn't get more out of the opening than he was expecting from the surprise. And to break down the action more, we got reinforcements coming in from Toronto as Danny is being joined by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Take it away, Danny. This opening, this outcome of this, what do you think? Will Nodirbek hold his game 1 with black?
Thanks, Tanya. I'm gonna ask Maxime that question because he's probably the one who has a little more to say than I do in regards to whether Nodirbek will hold. But I will quickly say it does look like Wesley's a little frustrated, maybe because Nodirbek knew this line, and the fact that the kid is up 2 minutes on the clock doesn't help. But Maxime, we're gonna dive in and analyze this. Your thoughts on what we see on the board before we maybe talk about the storylines off the board.
I think Wesley handled the opening surprise very well. I like his position. I was considering moves like, okay, first bishop d2, of course, get this knight back to b7.
Yeah.
I mean, no or later. And then knight g5 to avoid bishop e6.
Okay.
Create some threats around the king. But of course, the problem of doing that is this pawn on f2 becomes very relevant. So maybe it's a bit too risky. Like bishop g4 is possible still for black.
Yeah.
But in general, of course, there are much safer ways to play for Wesley. Like, you can grab the pawn on f2 and is very slightly better, but yeah, he can push somehow.
So you think Wesley, it feels okay, though, about his position right now?
Right now, I think he feels okay. He's just trying to find if there's a way to push for an advantage. Like, you can play c3 first, you can play many things.
Right.
So,
do you think he feels pressure in a 2-game match to push here with white? Obviously, Nodirbek has had some good victories as white, so...
Well, first of all, I think is we gained confidence after this first match of the day.
Yeah.
Where he was dominant. He had this slip in the third game, but in general, he was like clearly the best player today. And so, I don't think he feels bad at all if it goes to a second game with black. Of course, when it comes to Armageddon, it's a different thing because it's all relies on one single game. So. But he knows that Nodirbek will go for a full fight in the second game, and then maybe he'll try to make use of that. But right now he's looking if he has something to actually put pressure, maybe something like very direct, c3 before a4 to play a5.
So just pawn c3, pawn b4, pawn a4, and just try to advance on the queen side.
Yeah.
Yep.
But then I'm guessing a5 will happen, but maybe it's a way to go, because then you can go with...
Maybe black plays a5, though, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yep.
Maybe you go some bishop a3 somewhere, like, I don't know, because the bishop on b6 becomes also a little bit vulnerable. I don't know.
Okay.
It's a very complicated position, I must say. Like, you can easily make mistakes if you try to overpush with white or with black.
I like that, even with the queens off the board, that there's a lot of complexities going here. Okay, so we've seen inside the crystal ball of a super grandmaster's mind. Maybe some of these variations will happen on the board for fans, but I want to ask you the same thing we just asked Magnus. I think a lot of us saw Wesley as the favorite coming in for good reason. A lot of people, I think, feel that way, but Magnus said he thinks Nodirbek recovered well the day before and thinks Nodirbek's in form right now. So who do you think is favorite right now?
We had this discussion with Magnus.
Yeah.
I'm still going for Wesley.
Well, you're rooting for Armageddon first and foremost.
Of course.
Like me. Because we want more time on the couch out there.
Of course. I was very disappointed that we didn't get a third set between Magnus and...
Bobby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we want more chess.
We want more chess. That's what we're here for.
Yeah. But in general, I would say... so Magnus said that he feels Wesley is a bit shaky, so maybe he has more insight because he's in the room when they're playing. Mm-hmm. Maybe he feels more the tension that he inhabits Wesley. But Yeah, in general, I feel like it should be the favorite.
It's funny. What do you think about Magnus's comments about when he said he thinks both players have had great moments here, but both players have also looked extremely vulnerable at times?
Yeah, I think it's true for almost everyone here.
Maybe besides Magnus, or even Magnus, you think?
I would say Wesley was very dominant in the round-robin section. Magnus has been quite dominant, but against Fabi, he didn't show...
Yeah, that's true. He had some moments, yeah.
Yeah, he didn't show total control, for sure, so...
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes. Wesley has been the most stable player of the field, but it's true that he had these moments of nervousness.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
there's a lot at stake here, I guess.
Okay. I think Tanya's gonna chime in here. Go for it.
Yeah. Really cool insights there, Maxime, on the psychology of the opening that we're seeing. But I've got one more question for Maxime, Danny. That here in the studio, we've been talking so much about Nodirbek's death stare, just the way he looks so confidently at his opponents. And I want to ask Maxime, being on the opposite side of Nodirbek, what's been his experience with that? Is that something that he's noticed about Nodirbek?
Tanya's asking about...
I was hoping you'd say, could you repeat, please, Tanya?
Could you repeat, please, Tanya?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Tanya's asking what it's like to play Nodirbek, because they've been talking in the studio about the fact that he's very intense over the board. He's got a death stare. He kind of stares you guys down. Obviously, you've played a lot of intimidating characters in your time, but does that bother you at all, or what are your thoughts about the way he can really gaze into his opponent's eyes?
In general, during games, I very rarely look at my opponents. Okay. I'm completely unbothered. I'm focused on my play. I might be looking at the ceiling more than their faces.
You think that's true for all players, though, or?
That's just me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. When you're looking at the ceiling, are you going full Beth Harmon up there? Like, what are you looking at? Are you thinking about what you had for breakfast?
I can be thinking about any sort of random thing.
Yeah. Like a Nishigiri?
Probably not.
Not a Nishigiri. All right. Well, we're having a good time here. Anything else you want to say before we head back to the couch and just analyze?
No, I'm good.
Okay. You're doing good.
Yeah.
All right. We're gonna. He's unfazed.
Exactly. Unbothered.
And we're gonna go back to the couch and chill out. We're gonna throw it back to you guys now.
Yeah.
Thanks,
that's
Danny.
what we're gonna do.
That's what we're gonna do. All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys. Unbothered, unfazed. Really interesting, because I think when you're playing against a guy like Nodirbek, you need to do that. You need to just block out any sort of eye contact with him. He can be really scary. And I saw him give a little bit of a stare once again there.
I think the only thing making Maxime uncomfortable was this conversation and standing next to Danny. So it was successful in that regard. They're going to head back to the couch. But for these two players, there's no taking it easy. I mean, that king on h7 right now for Nodirbek Abdusattorov, it doesn't have too many squares. If you imagine a white rook landing on the h-file, it could fall victim to a checkmating net. That's not out of the question. And the bad pawn structure remains for black. Even material, but black's pawns are worse. So I do prefer, just like Maxime said, white's position. I think Wesley has chances in this endgame.
Definitely, and white's next few moves are straightforward. White would love to, for example, land a rook on h1, as you say, Robert, so maybe plant the king on e2. If you want to focus in, zone in on this e5 pawn, then you just shift your rook to the e-file. Simple play there. Beautiful outpost for your knight if you can land it, and maybe even expand pawns on the queen side. For black, it's far less clear what you should be aiming for. You need to balance out the long-term strategic deficiencies, especially these isolated pawns, with dynamic play, active play. But how do you achieve that? I was looking, for example, at this knight jump to try and hit the bishop, but the bishop just slides back with a check. And at the very minimum, you just move your rook across. Pressure. Black is the one certainly on the back foot. And I don't think Nodirbek is his type of position. Yes, he's great in endgames, but this one is far more static, his weaknesses. And unless he can gain that energy that he loves and make it more about calculation, then I think he's going to struggle.
But we know Nodirbek, he's so good when it comes to endgames. And right now, though, he has pressure and reasons to be worried about, but the kind of endgame technique that he's been showing in this tournament, I'm not worried for him in this one.
I definitely am worried. I just hate his pawn structure. And something that people should remember is that we like our pawns in the center during the early stages of the game because they restrict the enemy pieces. But in the end game, flank pawns can actually be super dangerous because they tie your opponent's pieces down to the side of the board while you activate your own pieces in the center. And one of the main moves we were just talking about, David was suggesting rook over to e1 next to that white king. Very logical, going after this pawn on e5. I just feel like there's so many weaknesses that black has to keep an eye on. And for Nodirbek here, he's a great endgame player, but nobody would be comfortable playing this from the black side.
All right, so Nodirbek needs to be a little careful, a little precise. Though he can start thinking about his own play. We know he loves the initiative. He does take out the bishop, the rook eventually hoping to land on the f file to try to put pressure on that eventually pinned knight on f2. But first, if Wesley gets in the pressure on the e5 pawn, will he go passive with his own rook, or is he expecting to continue more development, get that knight to d6, hit that bishop on c4? Is he going to look for initiative in this one?
You make it sound easy, Tanya, that the black pieces can flow forward. And, of course, Abdusattorov, he's an expert at making it look easy on the board. And I think you're right, that black knight will come in with gain of tempo in the next few moves. Do you line up the black rook against the white king, first of all? That's one question. I'm not sure whether the tactics work out there. You need to calculate a bit. Very minimum, you just defend your e-pawn. But no, he goes for that other option. Every move with tempo, gain time, hit the opponent's loose pieces, the knight hitting white's bishop and forcing it away.
To slide back. I think that Wesley can make a quick move. He's not playing this game that quickly overall, which I think is worrying for him, as his time trouble has been really a problem in his match against Nodirbek. Yesterday, Nodirbek was able to win an endgame where the eval bar was right at the middle because Wesley was not able to handle himself without too much time on the clock. But I think he can slide his bishop back to b3. Next, trade the dark square bishops if he ever needs to, but putting that one on the e3 square, and black's problems persist. I'm not trying to exaggerate the issue. Black should be able to hold, but shoulda, woulda, coulda. These are words that are not so meaningful when we're talking about blitz chess, which is the time control we're about to enter.
And the one thing I will mention today, because it's going to be a marathon day of chess, is that the last time we had a day this long on the Champions Chess Tour finals, it was when Abdusattorov took down Nakamura just a couple of days ago. So he does have the stamina. If he can survive this game, I think he'll be feeling super confident. Now that it's just a two-game shootout, essentially, I think this one, it's just important to survive with black. You don't want to get too ambitious. If you save this, you move on. You have white, maybe an Armageddon, but you're younger, you have energy. I think he might become the favourite if he holds.
That's the big if. And again, I think he would be able to do this. I see the pawn structure that you're pointing at, but I love the bishop's activity in this position. The rook lining up on the f line, but he decides to first defend the e-pawn. That can start marching up the board and create threats of his own. Right now, Nodirbek doing everything right, and it's been quite a journey for Nodirbek from the start. Took him 7 days to get the visa done, to get his travel sorted, to reach Toronto. So stamina is definitely not on his mind, because he's here, a determined Nodirbek, a very determined Nodirbek.
Such a phenomenal player. I think it's hard not to root for him. But Wesley So has many fans out there as he trades off those dark square bishops. So minimal pieces remaining. That may seem like good news for Nodirbek because white can't attack the weak pawns without pieces of his own. So both players are handling this very well. Whatever winning chances Wesley hopes to have are in the long term. But in the short term, it seems like Nodirbek, with the lead on the clock, playing excellent chess, and now he has to worry about two different pawns. See, Wesley, he's poking and prodding.
And the good thing in this position for black is that the white knight doesn't have too many squares to jump into the game to start putting pressure on that black e5 pawn. So Wesley has managed to maximize his pressure with the rook, but there isn't another assistance coming in to attack the weaknesses. Meanwhile, Nodirbek, his own knight can start jumping into enemy camp. Knight c4 in the air?
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
Maybe. He needs to act aggressively and actively here, because suddenly you don't want to curl up and be passive. It's a big weakness on the c6 square, and critical moment. Wesley So throwing a spanner in the works, hitting this pawn. Your move, Tanya, I guess would force the white rook to decide. Do you step back, defend this pawn? Do you slide across with a check? Suddenly it's getting a bit tactical. This check could mean that you eat this pawn, you grab this pawn with gain of time next move. I'm not sure where the black king goes, but you can take this pawn, hit the black rook right now.
Rook c8.
Rook c8. You have to do something with this bishop. Yeah, maybe it's working out for black. Maybe this pawn will simply drop next move. But this is what they're calculating right now. And the alternative, I guess, for Wesley So there is to just drop back, defend, and say, how are you defending this one? Not too easy.
Because the rook might get overloaded. He does play knight c4, does Nodirbek, and he's going to have a difficult next choice because if you bring your rook to c8, then you've lost sight of the e5 pawn, and I can kick your knight out of c4, go right after that e5 pawn. Thank you very much for the material. So these decisions are really difficult for Nodirbek, and that's why I tell people at home that when you have the eval bar, it doesn't always tell the full story because Nodirbek's on the defensive here, and Wesley knows it.
He knows it. He gives a check, not the move we were thinking, not keeping control. Maybe he's calculated something. Maybe he realizes that this pawn is juicy. He wants to, by force, snap it off the board. So a check, and the Black King has to decide. You normally don't want to go towards the edge of the board ever in chess, and especially in an endgame where you want to be centralized. I'm assuming the Black King will step towards the center, but the question is, what happens here?
There's a tactic. I think at the end here, Wesley wants to play bishop to b5, and after knight takes b2, there's rook f3, and all of a sudden you're being met by g4 or rook takes f5 with bishop b7 check. But no, I'm wrong because Wesley decides to go a different direction. He just pushes the pawn that was under attack, but there are all sorts of tactics in the air here.
Wow, it's suddenly getting really, really kind of concrete. Suddenly it's not about these general principles that we've been discussing. It's about whether Black can kind of survive, hold on, move by move. Especially the c6 pawn, it might just drop. You do not want to go to the edge of the board ever. Your knight will simply be pinned here and stuck here defending a mere pawn. So that's the last thing on Abdusattorov's mind right now. Knight attacked, pawn attacked, and he's on the back foot.
Nodirbek doesn't retreat. He doesn't go backwards. So I want to ask you a question. Is a knight to d2 a possibility? It gives a check, but I can very well end up getting trapped or losing material. Also, after giving a check on d2, White's king will step forward, putting pressure on that knight. The pawn on c6 still hanging. And I'm trying to figure out, do you move back with the knight to the center of the board?
Do you know what tells the biggest story, even more so than the moves that are being played? I'm looking at the clock. Nodirbek was up several minutes, and now he makes the wrong choice, goes to the edge of the board, and Wesley at any moment can push his b-pawn one more time, kick that knight out of there to win the c6 zone. But I like what Wesley is doing. He's not rushing. He's not giving key squares back to Nodirbek. Knight on the rim is looking dim here, and these pawns still are a problem for Black.
The knight looks dim, the position looks grim. He's pushing forward with his pawns, but I always talk about the theory of two weaknesses in middle games, end games. Here, Black has the horrible pawn structure, all of them isolated. Now the second weakness is just the placement of his knight. Wesley can play against that long term. He's happy to trade off the other minor pieces because if you compare the final pieces remaining, the white bishop will always dominate this black knight on the edge of the board. So a check. If this knight is not captured, it will simply slide back, blockade Black's central pawn. This is really classy stuff from Wesley So. This is where he thrives. And I still think Nodirbek is really going to need something special to save this game.
That's really great technique there, because when you trade, it's not just about the pieces that you've traded, but what remains on the board. And if you compare the white bishop to that black knight, it's clearly superior to the knight, which will be on the defense. But also Nodirbek does not have an option. He has to go for this. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes bishop. There's still a big threat of that b-pawn moving one step forward and deflecting the defender of the c6 pawn. b4, how do you fight it?
And let's not forget that the e4 pawn is also on a light square, and white has a light square bishop. So g5 is a great choice from Nodirbek. It allows him to bring his king forward and keep it attached to that pawn. But Wesley, he's not going to rush. Love that move, rook to g3. That rook did not have much real estate. Now it's going to slide to the h-file. That's a fully open line to work with. The white king can step forward at any moment. The black knight is not participating right now. It's merely a defensive piece.
He's undaunted, Wesley So. His rook was a bit stuck there. He's simply going to take his time out here, dropping back. He's going to reposition his rook, repurpose it. I mean, this is just so tough for Black to defend. And you can tell, looking at the clock, Abdusattorov, look at the body language as well, scratching his head. He can barely find a move. Yeah. There's not that much productive to do. And sooner or later, as soon as that white rook activates, the threats will increase. So, OK, he activates his own rook, trying to cut off the white rook's access to open files. Really clever move there. But now the black e-pawn has been abandoned.
Yeah, and there was so much hesitation by Nodirbek before he made this move, so he's definitely feeling uncomfortable in this endgame. And again, I've been talking about this idea of just winning the c6 pawn, and I'm trying to get my head around why has Wesley not already gone for b4 and bishop takes pawn?
because sometimes the pressure is actually the way to beat these top GMs. You can win a pawn, then give them activity. He just stole the pawn at the right moment, so I love the way he's played. And Nodirbek does look uncomfortable here. He's trying to will himself back in this game, but he lost a c6 pawn. e4 is now under attack. White has these outside pass pawns that he's going to struggle to deal with. He brings his king forward. Maybe he wants to go further even more, but Wesley gives a check. So if the king goes forward, rook g4 check will win the g5 pawn.
And look how calm Wesley looks right now. Just his body language. And meanwhile, Nodirbek with the piece twirling. You can tell that you don't even have to look at the board to understand what the evaluation is. You can look at the players and you know what's going on.
Then again, a bit of a scratch on the head of Wesley So, and he's repeated the position. The second time we've seen this, again, the second time we've seen this position, if Wesley gives a check, he might have the option to repeat, but he is a pawn up. Surely with white, he should be playing for the win.
He might be worried, though, because if the black rook can successfully slide to d8, in it comes to d2, and that white king is forced back to its first rank. And that can be scary, where you are up material, but it's your opponent who has the coordinated pieces. That rook on g3 is actually quite misplaced in this position. It doesn't have too much wiggle room. So Nodirbek, he loses a pawn. I don't even want to say he gave it up. I think Wesley outplayed him there, but he still has good chances.
Yeah, and Wesley, he has to decide ethical decision here. Do you play for a win in a short two-game match with white, a pawn up, but with a bit of risk attached, or do you take the draw, bail out now, safety, get closer to that Armageddon? He gives another check. Second time we've seen this position as well, and he plays on. He plays for the win.
He's going for it. He wants more in this position. Wesley So is up a pawn, and he's trying to get the match advantage in this one. The bishop is attacked. Watch out. Rook on coming to d2 as well once the bishop moves.
But this is clever stuff from Wesley. He repeated once, then he spent his time. He can bring his bishop to attack the knight. The problem is, if the black rook gives a check, he can first protect his bishop. So look what he's doing. Every single move, he's restricting black's access. I think that's a nice try, but it's clear the eval bar is not the biggest fan. It says the black is actually holding on.
Can you repeat here immediately with just the king shuffle, keep attacking the white rook?
I think Wesley has calculated well there. If the black king shifts over to attack white's rook, the white rook slides to the center. And look at the black pawn in the center. It will drop off. And once the white rook takes it, the black knight will also be hit. So actually, he's kind of setting a trap here, Wesley. So if the black king moves, white would have had a decisive advantage. Instead, the pawn pushes forward. A vulnerable square, but closer to promotion. Now the white bishop is really stuck. You cannot move it out of the way because the black rook will penetrate, will drop down to d2 with a check. You need to keep the black rook passive. And I think this is a really, really important move from Nodirbek.
And my question was going to be, what's black's next move? And Wesley, he poses the same question. If you can't actually improve your pieces, let's go. Push those pawns up the board. And Nodirbek pushes his own pawns. So now white has access to a pass pawn. He can, in fact, take that pawn on a5. If the knight takes back, down goes that e3 pawn in the center.
He takes it, more pawns off the board, but pawns on both flanks, more importantly. So the bishop better than the knight. And now, can he take on e3? Can he take the black pawn sitting in front of white's king? If he can, he's simply 2 pawns up and should win the game.
But perhaps that bishop is loose on d7, so Tanya's idea from earlier, king g6, just to kick that rook out of there. So Wesley might retreat his bishop now. That knight is on the rim, so bishop back to b5. The e3 pawn is still a weakness. Maybe black has to go all in, but you look at the time right now. Wesley, he's down to about 40 seconds. Nodirbek at 53. Both players getting nervous.
Wow. If Wesley So captures the pawn, the most natural-looking move, the black king just follows the white rook, and there is no way to keep the pressure on for white in that one. Wesley needs to find a way to keep this game going. If it's not king takes pawn, how does he keep the pressure? He can't move the bishop. The black rook will jump in. How do you continue the game?
I like Robert's move. Move the bishop where you control the black knight. Just keep that black knight sidelined on the edge of the board. But he does take the pawn. And now will we see this dance between the black king and the white rook?
You have a check on e6, but Wesley just repeating? And is he going to give a check on e6 next?
That's the big question, and he does give that check. There's no reason that he should just force a draw. If the king moves back, that white rook can attack the black knight. This is getting very messy, though, because that knight can hop around with some checks. Wesley needs to be careful at this stage.
Yeah, the white bishop is really stuck right now. The knight is attacked, but the knight can jump out the way with a check. The black knight has to save itself. Do not trade off white's bishop for that knight. White is 2 pawns up. And now the white king has to walk into a pin, attacking this black knight. But once the black knight moves, white's bishop, is it doomed?
But I think he's giving up his bishop. He's recognized that if I can trade rooks, I can't lose that endgame. Even though black has an extra knight, white at the very least can go to the king side and steal that last g-pawn. He's got passed pawns of his own, so it's going to be a counting game. And Nodirbek's down to 25 seconds. Is that a pawn too dangerous?
Great practical decision from Wesley So, playing on, testing Nodirbek. Zero risk still for white. Surely he's going to defend his bishop now, Wesley So. The white rook can step up one square to hold the bishop for a move longer. Yes, that bishop falls, but Robert, your idea. Go for that black pawn now. White has still 3 pawns remaining. The black knight is a short-range piece. Can it deal with all 3 pawns?
Wow, and look at Nodirbek. He just sets aside all the pieces, and it is go time for both these players. As Wesley saw, he has 2 seconds on the clock. He's burnt so much time.
The good news was it was a series of trades, quick moves. They gained 3 seconds per move. The knight does chase this pawn. And so the question is, can the knight get back in time? If that were a bishop, black is holding, because bishops are long-range pieces. But that knight might be slow to get back and chase down a potential passed G-pawn.
And here we go, the pawns disappearing, and it does look like Nodirbek here will be safe. It's only 2 pawns now. The knight will deal with one, the king deals with the other. Handshake, draw.
Nodirbek survives. What a fight. Wesley did everything he could to maximize his chances, but no, that he would be happy to take this into Armageddon. Will Wesley be the one who'd start getting ambitious? The black pieces did pay off in set 2 when Wesley had a crushing victory. And it's go time. It's 1e4. Are we going to see a Berlin?
Okay, the knights are out. And Wesley still adjusting his pieces. I hope he said Jadoub. And OK, his knight is out as well. Big moments ahead. Nodirbek does bring his bishop out. It's the Spanish opening. It is the Berlin defense, but anti-Berlin from Nodirbek. So no forced draw yet. If he wanted the draw straight from the off, he could have forced it there and then.
And what's this bishop a4 move? A little cheeky try from Nodirbek. Usually you put your bishop on a4 after a pawn goes to a6, but he voluntarily places his bishop on a4. It eliminates some of these knight d4 lines where black just tries to trade off all the pieces in the center. So it's a funny game thus far from these two. No forced draw. Nodirbek showing that he may want to play on.
Yeah, he means business, this bishop a4 move, Robert. I don't know why, but I've had the bad luck of being on the wrong end of it a few times. A few of my opponents have played this one. It just keeps the tension, takes out these knight d4 ideas, quick d5 ideas. No way for black to break the immediate tension. So we're pretty much guaranteed a long maneuvering game. And I must admit, I'm a bit surprised here. It's not consistent with Nodirbek's interview. He said a draw, Armageddon, pretty much, it's fine. But he wants to fight. He wants a long battle here. And Wesley, again, the first to think.
And it was that little pawn move on move number 4 when Nodirbek played d3, going in for the anti-Berlin, that seems to show that Nodirbek is in for the long game in this one. And bishop to a4, that last move by Nodirbek, at least it made Wesley go into a little bit of a think and use up some of that clock, which is critical in these situations.
It's not your standard line. So for Wesley, he can't rely on all his preparation, and he does lash out with pawn to d5. This can ruin black's pawn structure, you may think, with double pawns, but I would prefer to have the bishop pair in an opening position. So I think that for Nodirbek, he's more likely to bring his knight out from b1 out to d2, just defend that pawn in the center. I do not think he's capturing that knight on c6 with his bishop.
Yeah, and trading pawns off in the center also has its downsides. If white takes this black pawn in the middle with his own pawn, black would have a space advantage. So really tense position. We mentioned a lot of maneuvering ahead. Wesley is the one to try and clarify the tension. He's the one to try and trade things off, try and guide this game towards safety. Suddenly it's Nodirbek thinking, yeah, I was praising him a moment ago. This bishop a4 move, a nice sneaky one. Okay, he keeps the tension, doesn't spend too long. So backing up this small surprise in the opening. Yeah, this one, it feels like it's going to simmer for a long, long time. It's just about whether it eventually explodes later on this middle game.
And Nodirbek continues with his development, not giving free play. You really don't want to trade on d5, allowing a weakness on d3, so keeping the tension in the center. But to my understanding, in these openings, when black does get a central break like d5, that's already a mini success for black.
It is a success because you get activity for your pieces. Most of these top players don't like sitting passively. But one of the downsides is when you push it to d5 like he's done instead of d6, your e5 pawn can be a bit tender. He has it all under control thus far thanks to his rook on e8. And Wesley takes away the g5 square from any of white's pieces. For Nodirbek, oftentimes you bring your queen out to e2 or your rook to e1. But this is a draw that we could possibly see. You got like rook e1, knight g4. We've seen that in so many different positions where someone goes after the f2 pawn, the rook slides back, and the black knight slides back as well. I'm just, joking here. But it is possible that if the players don't really want to continue this game, there are ways to get this back and forth three-time repetition, which means that it would be a draw.
I just wonder if Nodirbek wanted that early draw. Would he have gone for an anti-Berlin? Would he have not just gone for the trades, the normal Berlin, and kind of secured it faster?
Yeah, I think we were all a bit thrown off. We were all a bit speechless. We thought this might be a short game, but suddenly the players really digging deep, all pieces, all pawns on the board. Clarity far away right now. And Robert, you're kind of joking, but not really joking about this this maneuver, because if Nodirbek does play his rook across one square right now into the center, rook e1, probably the most natural move in the position. Black does have that option, and we could see a quick repetition. So Nodirbek may be mulling over in his mind as well, whether to keep the fight alive, whether to play a move such as pawn to h3 and maintain the tension. And yeah, I also just reminded of this interview we had with Danny and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, avoiding the Nodirbek death stare. Wesley, throughout today, he has had his hand on his head, just breaking eye contact. We see Nodirbek mirroring that body language right now.
Yeah, Wesley not so unbothered about the death stare. I think he's just not been looking Nodirbek's way. So if Nodirbek was to choose the pawn move that you were hinting at on the king side, step up the h-pawn one step ahead, that would at least imply that he wants the game to go on. How ambitious it is of an approach, we'll find out later, but at least it keeps the game and keeps the tension on the board. So on the other hand, if he slides in with the rook, we might have a really, really quick road to the Armageddon. And he does slide in with the rook. But this is moment number 2, because if Wesley does go up with the knight, there is one more way to defend the f2 pawn.
Yeah, the rook can slide up instead of back to where it came from. So knight g4 is the move that we have been discussing. We have seen this in high-level games when people just want to make a draw. The rook goes back to f1, and because the knight is not really doing anything on g4 anymore, it can go back to f6, and then the rook slides back to e1. It's not really Nodirbek's style to make a draw in this manner, and as Tanya was indicating, you can bring your rook up into e2 rather than to the side. It's just a bit awkward to do that. You will play h3, kick the knight back, and then probably move your rook back to e1 anyway, because it's on an awkward square. So these are decisions that the players don't take lightly, and for Wesley, you look at him, is he in a fighting mood in this game? Does he really want Armageddon? Because if we believe what some of the people have been saying, he's the stronger player, the higher rated player, the player with more experience, maybe he wants to try his hand in a rapid game versus an Armageddon game where the odds may tilt in the youngster's favor.
Magnus mentioned in his interview earlier that he likes to see it go down to the wire. If there is an option for the match to continue longer, we'd all love to see more chess. But for now, Wesley doesn't go for the move that we were talking about, which could potentially invite a repetition. But instead, he goes for the pawn trade. And now, if Nodirbek was to recapture with the pawn, the most natural one, we could still see the knight jumping onto g4 and similar lines.
Yeah, moment of truth. Wesley still has this option available to him. And you mentioned Magnus wanting to see more chess. Magnus also wants to tire out his opponents before tomorrow, because he knows he's facing one of these two. He wants to see them push each other to the limit. But Wesley doesn't go for this knight jump, doesn't put pressure on the f2 square. Instead, gains some space on the queen side, prevents white from advancing on that flank, maybe also activating the black rook kind of down and across the board. We've seen so many rook swings, rook lifts this whole tournament. And I think he's justified in playing on. There's no reason to kind of bail out, to try and escape. There's no reason that you're worse with black, simply. And right now, still pressure on Nodirbek to justify this whole opening. Why should white be better here? He moves his queen, gets off the first rank, and just looks very level, very even to me.
It is indeed, and we've seen this type of position at the highest level in the Madrid candidates in 2022. Hikaru Nakamura, Timur Rajabov had a similar structure like this with a pawn on a5. It's good because it stops white from lashing out with pawn to b4 and gaining some space, but it gives the b5 square to white. That a5 pawn can be targeted, especially if the knight on d2 hops out to c4. So this may seem quiet. The eval bar may be right in the middle, but just like game one, there could be more to it than meets the eye, and both players do need to keep a watchful eye on different squares and different pieces.
And Robert, you were in Toronto last year where Wesley went on to win the event. Do you feel that he's in the similar mindset? Do you feel he's got the same focus, same zen?
With all respect meant towards every single other player that was in Toronto last year, a certain player wasn't. Magnus Carlsen. So I keep saying it, and it's not even because I want to root for anybody. I never do as a commentator. But when Magnus Carlsen plays on even terms with everyone else, he is the favorite. So Magnus was not there last year. Hikaru was there to really nicely played match from Wesley to take down Hikaru Nakamura when most people thought Hikaru would win the whole thing. So Wesley, that was his really shining performance in his career, but Magnus wasn't there. So I don't think the mindset is similar. And by Wesley's own words, he said he just wanted to finish, I think, top 6 or something like that. He's doing way better than that.
Absolutely, and that was at the start when we had a chat with Wesley asking about his ambitions in this tournament, and he revealed that he'd be happy to just make it to survival, to be in the top 6. But the chess that he's produced, the aggressive play that we've seen him all throughout the round-robin stage, going on up until even today what we saw, it just feels like a very different Wesley, not the solid Wesley, not the one who's just waiting for his opponent's mistakes, but the one who's provoking those mistakes with active play.
Yeah. And we should also remember that there's so much at stake in this game alone. You talked about Wesley trying to come top 6. Now he wants to come top 2 minimum. The difference between second and joint third place for the player who's eliminated here is an incredible amount of money, tens of thousands of dollars. And that's life-changing, especially for someone so young as Abdusattorov, but also for Wesley. It could really set him up. Plenty at stake. Both players fearing defeat, but also desperate to win.
I wonder if that's on their mind, because there's a $50,000 difference. So if a player wins this game, they secure themselves minimum $100,000. The loser, well, they'll take some solace with $50K. Still a great prize day for them, but that's a lot of money at stake, and that could make people more nervous.
It's a lot of money, but I think for these two players, right now, they're not thinking about any of that. They're not even thinking about meeting Magnus in the finals. It's the position on the board. It's about getting through this very match. And for that, the big question is, will it be decided on this one? Will the players try to push? There is no margin for error. This is a best of 2. This is the final rapid game. Or will they take it more cagey, more cautious approach, taking it down to the Armageddon? But in this format, you can't hide for too long from a decisive result.
You can't hide for too long, and we did see a shake of the head from Wesley So briefly before he tried to revert to that poker face, and I think it might be because White's position has been improving. Black's less so, or at least less obviously so. Wesley's messed around a bit, especially this last rook move, a bit mysterious, the black rook on b8. Unless he's throwing pawns down the board here and now, then that could just be a superfluous move. Meanwhile, White has achieved the dream setup in any Spanish opening or Italian opening. The 2 white knights love to park themselves on these squares, f3, g3. And great attacking potential for Abdusattorov suddenly.
And as Danya likes to say, if you do step A, you have to continue with step B. Rook b8 hints at the move b5, but I don't think that Black can get away with it, at least not in a way that Wesley would prefer, because there's a queen on e2 and a bishop on a4 teaming up on that square. There will be some tactics here, but b5, bishop takes b5. This has to be calculated, and the engine is also saying slightly better for White. So not the end of the world, but knight d4 tactics. It's really the ones you try to uncork. White can take this back with the knight, which does protect that bishop over there on b5. There will be some trades in the center, but White temporarily, at least, is up a pawn. Black would have to prove the compensation.
Yeah, this is not Wesley's style to sacrifice speculatively like this and try and hope that he gains enough compensation later on. Maybe he does, because the black rook on the b file is so active, the black rook on the e file is so active. This pawn is extremely weak, but yeah, it's hard to envisage him going for this one right now. b5, it looks like the consistent follow-up, but he's hesitating. The longer he thinks, the less inclined he'll likely be towards that pawn push. And what else? You would love to kind of copy White and put the... Sorry, my arrows are going funky there. Put the black knight over on g6. But the problem is the e5 pawn might be hanging on the way. So after a trade of bishops, you'd be forced to take back with the knight just to hold this pawn. And suddenly it looks a bit clumsy. These 2 knights are clearly inferior to White's stallions on the king side. And yeah, it just feels like you might get tied up in knots. So what's he going for? He plays the bishop to d6. Another clumsy move. The bishop looked active. Now it's very much passive, but it's all to do with this knight maneuver. Next, he wants to bring his knight over to the king side.
And it's also a trade that you want, right? You want to get out of this potential pin, but also get out of this light squared bishop dynamic that exists. Knight e7 would offer the bishop trade and allow a more free hand on the queen side for Wesley to go forward. I do like the idea of knight e7. Bishop d6, a retreating move, but it comes with a plan.
I just don't see why rook b8 was necessary. Like, bishop b6 makes perfect sense to me. You want to wrap your knight around. And if he can successfully get the knight to g6, I do believe he's equalized. But I think he's shaking his head because he feels that rook b8 was inaccurate. Doesn't actually have a point to it. And for white right now, for Nodirbek, he needs to play precisely, because if he doesn't keep up this pull in the position, it will just be neutral territory, it will be equal. Maybe move like rook d1. I think that does make knight e7 harder to accomplish, because after knight e7, if I take on d7, once again, you can't take with the queen because the e5 pawn is vulnerable there. And the engine gives up a pawn, no problem. I would be looking at this and saying, what did I just do? The engine just doesn't care.
All right, it's a moment for Nodirbek to think if he wants to play prophylactic chess. There's also ideas that black has with this move, rook b8, which you often describe as a mystery move in these openings. It kind of is preemptive of pawn advances, of expansion on the queen side, and then suddenly rook b8 does make a little bit of a sense. I think it's one of those slow moves that in the beginning it's harder to understand, but once the pawns start moving down the board, you're like, okay, I'm glad I have my rook on b8.
Yeah, the top players, they somehow make these mysterious moves work. Yeah. Sometimes they play a move, it looks a bit silly, and then 10 moves, 20 moves down the line, you're like, oh, wait, that was the point. So you might be right, Tanya, and Abdusattorov seems to agree that you're right, because he's blocked the advance of the black b-pawn. The black knight goes back now, as predicted. If we see a trade of light-squared bishops, yes, white's left with his superior bishop, but the more pieces off the board, the less cramped black is. Look at this maneuver, Nodirbek preempting black's decision to try and reroute that knight to the kingside now. He's trying to land his own knights, maybe into the f5 square. Interesting idea.
Knight on f5, dark square bishop for white. That has the makings of an attack, so you do need to be careful if you're Wesley. You want to trade on your own terms, and trading off light square bishops that should favor white. And if you ever push your pawn to c6 to keep your light square bishop on the board, you're keeping those pieces, that's true, but you're also creating weaknesses for yourself. So these are not easy decisions. I like Nodirbek's clock. Usually when he's ahead by a couple minutes, it's when he's playing his best chess and putting the pressure on Wesley. In game 3 of set 2 earlier today, Nodirbek was down 2-0. He had the black pieces. He was up on time. He even made a mistake that let Wesley back in the game, but Wesley didn't have enough time at the end, and Nodirbek brilliantly won that one. So I do like the clock management for Abdusattorov.
All right, happy with the clock management here. For Nodirbek, it is about whether the bishops stay alive or not, and they don't. They do get traded off, and Wesley continues to offer trades right now. Queen to d7. If that's taken off the board, we're going to see black trying to get those pawns moving up. Meanwhile, white, that attack that you're talking about, without the queens, it loses teeth.
Yeah, and a trap in the position, that's always a bonus. Just to mention, there is a pawn up for grabs. Suddenly we see the point of Wesley's move, rook b8. He's saying, oh no, my pawn. And if white goes and takes this pawn, the rook goes back where it came from, and suddenly, oh no, my queen. The queen is trapped on the edge, and really sneaky idea there. You mentioned that, Tanya, after queen to d7, if the queens disappear, I think black has no problems whatsoever. The pawn will land on a4, the pawn will come to b5. The black knight is actually poised perfectly to start hopping into some holes in the white position, and this would be dead level. So if Nodirbek here wants to maintain some tension, wants to play for the win, I think he might be forced to retreat, but suddenly black has certainly gained something in this exchange. White has lost a bit of time, and whether that's advancing with the black pawns on the queen side, whether that's planting the black bishop back on a nice diagonal before the white bishop reaches this square on e3, I think Wesley has solved his problems. I think he's equalized.
It's all about those holes, because the d3 square, like you mentioned, the f5 square for a white knight, and neither Nodirbek or Wesley, I mean, they don't know the evaluation here, whether to trade queens. How equal is it? It looks equal. It should be with best play, but you never know if one side has a slight advantage. And for Nodirbek, he typically doesn't like trading down and just accepting that it's equal. He may have some ambitions, but now he takes the queen, and he may be sending us to Armageddon.
Looks likely at this point. Yes, the white knight has landed on f5, but there's no attack connected to it because the queens are off the board. I don't think it's really a strategic threat to even take this black bishop. Black's bishop is clearly inferior to white's knight right now. And, yeah, it wouldn't damage the black pawn structure too severely long term. I think Wesley will either move his bishop, move the black knight, maybe even start pushing some pawns in the next couple of moves. And really hard to imagine either side winning this one.
Nodirbek's statement from that interview earlier. Seems like we're getting closer to that as the pieces get traded off the board. White's knight has found its active spot. Black without any problem here. White without any weakness here. If anyone, I think black can try to push. If you think about pawn breaks here, Wesley might be the one who might start thinking again about the thematic break with b5, b4. Would that give any chances for black in this endgame?
Get some activity, that's for sure. But anytime you play for a win in a position like this, you could be playing for a loss to some extent, because throwing all your pawns forward, it leaves holes behind. I sound like Stanley Yelnats. I'm just talking about holes all the time. But this position remains all zeros. It looks like that knight can take the bishop on d6 at some moment. White can push the pawn to f3, keep everything under control. I'm not too worried for Nodirbek or for Wesley. Both of them are with a steady hand. It's equal.
And to make it more equal, perhaps Nodirbek will offer a bishop trade on e3, because if you compare pieces, that black bishop on c5, to me, it looks more active than the white's bishop, and you also need to get that a1 rook into the game. We've been talking so much about Nodirbek's endgame technique and how that kind of separates him from his colleagues and his generation, just because he willingly goes into endgames and seems to outplay from these minuscule advantageous positions. Sometimes the advantage isn't even clear. How does a player really improve his endgame technique at such a young age?
Well, it's impressive. I think Nodirbek, one of his big strengths in the endgame is his calculation. He's especially good in endgames with small imbalances. He's especially good in queen endgames where it's very forceful, where he can kind of work out his path concretely. In general, it's just about practice, these endgames. There are books out there. There are chessable courses on endgames. I'm not going to name drop one of mine. But yeah, in general, it's all about practice. The more you play endgames, and Nodirbek plays so many games throughout a year, the more you learn, essentially. And he's practicing against the best. He's learning from the best, playing against Magnus, playing against Wesley, Nakamura, all these fantastic endgame players. And that's what's made him so good today at such a young age.
And it's one of those hardest things to improve on, right? Because like you're saying, it's about experience, the play, the amount of times you've actually faced an endgame against a top player. And for him at this young age to get so strong at it, it's really a unique quality about his chess.
And unlike openings, where they start from the beginning of the game and you just make moves, to get that practical training exercises from an endgame. What is an endgame that you should be studying? What does a position look like? There's this famous book, Endgame Strategy, by Mikhail Shereshevsky, that I've recommended time and time again. Really wonderful. It looks like just this position. Most players would just shake hands, and you see one side outmaneuvering the other. And you have to look, what are the pluses? What are the minuses? What are some squares that I can take advantage of? Right now, I love Wesley's move h5 that he played, because he wants to follow up with his g-pawn pushing, and he's not going to hang a pawn on the right-hand side of our board. So I think that, to study endgames like this, you go to a position like this and you play it out. Maybe with a friend, you just train a little bit, maybe even against the engine, and see how you do.
Requires so much patience. And we've seen so many tactical finishes in both of their matches. But to me, one of the most impressive was from set one, this endgame that Nodirbek actually converted. And Wesley himself, he's a technical expert. But Nodirbek in that 2 versus 1, a rook and knight endgame, just outplayed and managed to win that. And that can be really terrifying. Right now, both players, of course, playing very slow. And I think this is a very level game. And it just comes down to how much they actually want to continue with this. Will they take risks? Will they start pushing pawns? At some point, to create chances, you have to push pawns.
You have to push pawns, but where? And remember, pawns don't move backwards, so you don't want to push too far that the pawns become weaknesses or the squares behind them become weaknesses. And you can see that Wesley's pushed his rook's pawns, the black A and black H pawns, because those only gain space. Nothing really serious is left behind. And yeah, right now, a bit of a decision whether to chop off that knight or not. Wesley says no. The white knight looked like it was about to become strong by jumping into the center, but I'm going to fend off any threats there. I'm going to cover all the squares. And yeah, actually, if anyone, I like the progress that Wesley's making. He's gained space, he's covered squares. There's easy plans. The black king is going to centralize. In endgames, it's all about these mini plans, small plans of improvement. First, improve the pawn structure. Second, improve the pieces, that type of thing. And it feels like both sides, both players are just well-versed in this.
I'm with David. There just aren't any imbalances here. The bishop can take this knight on e3 if you're looking at this from the perspective of Wesley So, but you would want to do that if you could take control of a light square. When your opponent has a bishop, it's inherently limited to that color complex. You want to take advantage of the other complex as a knight can jump from color to color. But there aren't squares to take advantage of here. There's only one open file. We saw one pair of rooks trade. We'll likely see another pair trade once that bishop gets out the way. And without material remaining on this board, it just seems like there's not too much life left. And you can see by their movement here, trades are about to happen. I think we're heading to Armageddon.
We've been saying that for a while, and it looks like it's going to become a reality soon. And that last knight move, you might be asking, why is Nodirbek not developing that rook on a1? It will develop if Wesley does decide to trade on b3. You do land up on the open file. So Wesley delaying that decision, keeping the tension on the queen side. And I think neither players are going to blink with a trade with that a and the b pawn.
Yeah, black definitely doesn't want to trade and develop the white rook for his opponent on an open file without even forcing the rook to move. And likewise, white will not trade off because white will be left with those split pawns. We all learnt from that bowling analogy from Robert. Do not split the pawns. But wow, really ambitious, I will say, pushing the pawn to b4, bypassing black's a pawn, because now we talked about some loose squares, and it's about those light squares. The c4 square was ready and ripe for the black knight to jump into. He puts his knight on the rim to prevent the black knight hopping. Wow, Abdusattorov putting paid to these assumptions we're making.
And that's the problem, is when you assume, when you get complacent and your opponent's still going on, then you can lose track of the position. You can lose the plot. And I've had games just like this where I just assume it should be a draw. And here comes the dark square bishop for white. Now that knight was threatened, so Wesley jumps back to the last rank. And I'm looking at the clocks as well. Nodirbek has a healthy lead on time. If you can poke and prod and create maybe a little hole, maybe a weakness, the a4 pawn in particular, he could possibly play for a win at this stage.
And if you are playing for a win, do you want to trade off the last pair of rooks?
Tough question. I love and hate that you both looked at me at the same time because it's so difficult. Who wants to trade the rooks? I would say maybe white now, just because with rooks off the board, black's a pawn looks like a bit of a target. It looks like it's just stepped a bit too far. That's why I was so surprised earlier that Wesley pushed the pawn. We were talking about pawns not moving backwards. It's so committal. I have commitment issues. A lot of people will tell you that. But yeah, that black pawn could live to regret the day that it stepped onto white's half of the board. And yes, the king has come into the center, but moment of truth, can Abdusattorov trade rooks off?
He's in no rush to, because he can play rook d1 at any moment, and there's only one open file. Black's rook sits on that file. He can play a little bit on the king side. So maybe rook g1, one of those moves that make your intentions clear, or so you think. Am I really going to push that g-pawn? At least you're going to have to calculate it. So for Nodirbek, he can trade off the rooks right now. That will simplify the position. That a4 pawn is hard to touch. White doesn't have too many pieces remaining, and that's all that black needs to make sure is defended.
And we've been trying to understand the mindset of these two players. Do they want more? Do they want to go into the Armageddon? Will we see a quick draw? Will this go on to be a grind? And I think it's that cautiously ambitious approach that we're seeing. He's still keeping the tension. The play does go on. And there are still these small nagging problems for black to be solved on the queen side. You pointed out that a-pawn. The bishop from e3 now, quite an active piece. The pawn on b4, limiting black's own dark squared bishop from activity. And yes, the only open line is captured by Wesley's rook. But that king on e2, it takes away all penetrating squares.
Yeah, right now it looks like white stabilized, and I can tell by our voices we've liked the kind of last few moves, the way they've gone in white's favor. But Wesley still not too many weaknesses, and now he's offering a trade of knights. And I think if the knights disappear, probably the remaining winning chances disappear with them. But at this point, who knows? Abdusattorov playing on. I just wanted to ask, now we're around the 3-minute mark for both, who's impressed you the most when the clocks have ticked down?
Definitely Nodirbek for me. I think that Wesley sometimes panics. We saw that in set 1 in that end game where he was holding on for dear life, and then unfortunately for him, he went wrong very late in that game. And here, Wesley's doing everything perfectly, and he's keeping 2 minutes 44 seconds on his clock. So I think just in terms of time trouble, I would take Nodirbek in a scramble.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Robert. I think he's just shown nerves of steel throughout. He doesn't let the nerves get to him, Nodirbek. We just saw it today itself, right? This crazy position with Black's king and with Nodirbek's king out in the open, how he went on to play and convert that into a win. He's taken so many Armageddons, and I think he's been just fearless with just seconds on the clock.
Yeah, fearless, and Wesley offers, no, I was going to say a rook trade. The way he moved the piece there was a bit unorthodox. I thought he touched his rook. He takes with the bishop, so leaving the tension. Now it's actually white who holds the d file for now, and Nodirbek really ambitiously pushes his pawn forward to b5. That has totally removed the option now of black touching queenside pawns. Black's a pawn is a huge target long term. Actually, if the rooks disappear, maybe white would be winning this suddenly. And he's pushing all of the pawns forward on light squares, notice, because white has a dark squared bishop. Therefore, he wants to control both color complexes. Bishop, dark squares, pawns, light squares. Wesley maybe feeling a bit uncomfortable.
The problem for Nodirbek, and he's playing this so extremely well, he doesn't have pieces to attack that a4 pawn with. There's only one open file. The rook on d1 is doing a good job there. But if he keeps pushing his pawns, then that black rook will slide up to a5 and challenge those pawns. So it does feel like Nodirbek has made progress, and yet I'm not sure where to next.
Yeah, it looks nice and beautiful, but that's always the tough thing when it's almost symmetrical, the pawn structure, when there's no clear weaknesses, when it's the same kind of balance of pieces, both here with rook and dark squared bishop. You need some kind of targets. You need those two weaknesses. Here, black has 0 weaknesses to probe at, so still should be a draw. But he's going for it, Nodirbek.
He's really going for it. He's just pushed that pawn all the way to c5. Now that white king is about to arrive on c4. And to me, it just looks like Wesley has allowed too much to happen. You were talking about no piece assisting white to attack a4. That king. King is a piece in the endgame. King c4, king b4, and suddenly I'm putting pressure.
Yeah, really ambitious move. And black does have the option now of coming back with his rook, giving a check, kicking back the white king. But a rook trade, and suddenly black's pawn would be helpless. The white king would be superior. And Wesley, he's pushing forward, creating a route in for the black rook.
Really clever play there from Wesley So that he's going after the e4 pawn. He went f5 earlier, so if the white king starts running on over to try to grab that a3 pawn, you'll lose sight of the e4 pawn. So rook c1, is there going to be a pawn push to c6? You have to be careful, because if there's a rook behind a pawn, you can maybe even sacrifice a piece to free it and spring it to the other side. I actually think rook a4 here would be a pretty big blunder from Wesley. He can't get away with that.
Yeah, and this is really storming up right now. Both players under 2 minutes. Wesley under a minute and a half right now. And this is the most exciting the game has gotten. So many structural changes. Black has pushed that pawn all the way to a3, where it is a glaring weakness. You always need to watch out. He loses that pawn. That could be close to just a match over.
Yeah, it's suddenly heating up, and it's not heating up in the typical way with attacks, checkmates. It's heating up in terms of the fact that Wesley is walking a tightrope. He's got to avoid certain kind of pitfalls here, and he trades a set of pawns. This doesn't damage too much. Hesitation from Nodirbek. He takes back and, okay, attacking white's pawns now. Still feels like this could switch, this could flick, just turn in either direction with one mistake. But right now, do you push a pawn? Do you defend that pawn? Big questions for Nodirbek.
Or do you go for the Armageddon with king to c4, rook gives a check, king comes back, rook goes back. We'll find out who's ambitious here.
Ooh, but then the black rook could get in via b4 and come in and behind. Okay, the rook does try to come behind, but first, having forced white's rook into passivity, really tense position. How does either side make progress? It's not obvious anymore.
If you gave black some free moves, I'm not sure what he's going to do. So look, a small pawn move, and Wesley brings his king back. I think white can bring the rook up to b3, just keeping an eye on that a3 pawn. I think that neither side can really budge at this stage. They might have to shuffle back and forth. I don't see any inroads.
Yeah, white's bishop is tied down defending the c5 pawn. White's rook is tied down defending b5. White's king is tied down defending white's central pawn. It looks like he might have maximized Abdusattorov here. He's really pushed everything forward, especially on the queen side, but no further. And Wesley So's just yo-yoing back and forth with the black king. He's got simple waiting moves. Will we see a plan? Will we see a winning idea from the youngster here? Rook back to b1. That hints at the answer being no. The rooks come from this square. And Wesley continues to wait with his king as well.
And I think it comes down to this now. Both players maximize the position as much as they can, tie down each other's pieces. And Nodirbek says that this is it. It goes into Armageddon. We got a big one coming up. A level game throughout. That's what happens when two of the best players play top-level chess. It ends in a draw and goes down to sudden death.
I was going to say there's little separating them. There's nothing separating them right now. It's an even score. We are heading to Armageddon. You see them considering. They're talking to each other and laughing. They got to focus on their bids.
Tomorrow morning. Of course. No, that's not going to happen.
which player gets the kind of middle game that they enjoy playing? Will Wesley get his solid approach, or will Nodirbek be able to create initiative? And Wesley surprises first with the English opening.
The English opening, it's 1c4, and some quick moves here, some very quick moves from Nodirbek as he builds a strong pawn center with black. We see pawns disappearing already in the middle of the board, and a transposition to what we call the Tarrasch defense, where black often accepts an isolated pawn, but compensates with dynamism. Really fast start to this game by both players.
And for Wesley So, he doesn't mind having the white pieces. He beat Magnus Carlsen with white in an Armageddon, but it's a very different type of position than this. Here, it's going to be a struggle. Is that isolated queen pawn, the pawn on d5, is it a weakness, or is it something that black can play around? You have open files when you have an isolated pawn. The adjacent files are free for the black rooks to step on those lines and stare into the white position.
And when you're the one with the isolated queen's pawn, what you have in compensation is play, is the activity. You're looking at not only taking control of the open files, as Robert pointed out, jumping forward with your pieces. The knight from f6 will land on e4 at some moment. For white, it's going to be all about doubling down on that d5 pawn. One thing's for sure, that these middle games are going to be dynamic with the asymmetrical pawn structure.
Yep, and dynamic is not the name of black's last move. Pawn to h6, I'm really surprised by that one. One thing I will mention is that Wesley So is one of the best players against an IQP that I've seen in a long time. When he faces this isolated queen's pawn, Wesley So, he has a great track record, often just controlling squares, outmaneuvering the opponent. Both of white's bishops now are on the longest diagonals, fianchettoed. Will their X-ray vision come into effect? Nodirbek, having to play quickly, tries to break down white's queenside structure.
I really like that move because you couldn't let Wesley have all the fun. You're trying to carve out some squares for your own pieces. If you take on a5, then that means the a3 pawn, that becomes a weakness long term. And if you don't take it until you push your pawn forward, that hands black some critical dark squares on the queen side, namely c5 and b6. So this is the right approach from Nodirbek. You don't give your opponent all the space without countering.
But he has burnt a minute. Both players have burnt around 1 minute right now. And Wesley, the first long pause of this game, he just needs to decide how to fix the structure, how to decide the structure, clarify it on the queen side. And the key moments are still to come, still ahead. But cagey start now, especially with Wesley So going into the tank. He needs to move. He needs to keep his time advantage because black's position is still healthy for now.
That last move, it feels as if things are brewing up in the position. Cagey so far, but a5, that's the first question in the position that Wesley needs to answer. What does he do with the b pawn? It's attacked not only by the pawn, but the bishop on e7 as well. Do you defend it, keeping the tension? Do you push it, giving away some key squares in the position? I think pawn takes pawn would be the last option on my radar here. Giving a solid weakness on a3 is not what solid Wesley will ever do.
I would want to push the pawn to keep the game going, and exactly, not to force off a series of trades. But look at how quickly and confidently Nodirbek is responding to Wesley's moves. He understands the plans very well. He may have made a quiet h6 move, but he's just developing the rest of his pieces now. That knight can hop out to a square like b6, and there it goes. It's defending the IQP. The light square bishop is free, and watch out for the light squares on white's queenside. That knight can hop into c4, and suddenly it could be trouble for Wesley.
Yeah. Potentially missed this last move by Wesley So because he's allowing black's knight to hop in and suddenly trouble. White's dark square bishop is a big, big target. I think he's actually arranged his pieces suboptimally here, Wesley So, and you can tell the usage of the clock right now. Nodirbek has spent 1 minute. Pretty much 1 minute since he started this game. Wesley has spent almost 3 minutes. So the clock times are starting to get closer together. Nothing wrong has happened here at all for Nodirbek, so I think he wins the opening battle. And he should be feeling the more confident of the two.
Already a kind of position where black is the one who's pushing for the initiative. And once again, it's white who has to win on demand. Black needs only a draw, a knight trade offered. I don't expect Nodirbek to trade and ease off the pressure. I like the idea of the knight jumping forward to c4 to put pressure on that bishop on b2. Also, that a3 pawn on white's queen side is a weak target. He reaches out. It does arrive on the board. It looks like Wesley's pieces are lacking coordination right now.
It looks really not fun for Wesley. Look at that knight on a4. It's on the rim. It offered a trade. Trade was refused. The knight on c4 hits the bishop on b2. And if that bishop moves forward on that dark square diagonal, that a3 pawn is in the sights of black's pieces, namely that knight that just hopped into c4 and the bishop on e7. I'm not liking this at all for Wesley. It's a must-win game. He's the one who's burning clock. And Nodirbek, he's just making very natural, developing moves that have a clear purpose.
Yeah, black still has the isolated queen's pawn, but we're forgetting about that factor because it's not relevant right now. Black's isolated pawn, if anything, just covers some key squares and helps the black pieces. And pawn sacrifice from Wesley So, he is saying, take me, take that white a3 pawn. He's trying to at least activate the white pieces. And I think a good decision in an Armageddon game. But objectively, can black take the pawn? That is the big question. Nodirbek, for the first time in this game, is pausing, stopping. He is tempted. Is greed good here? And that's the question. Black could just ignore things, develop, bring out the black light square bishop to any square pretty much. But key moment, the first critical moment of this game.
Big questions to Nodirbek. And he has to decide on the board. He mentioned in his interview, calculation is what he likes to do, but he has to do it quick. And he does decide to not go into the complications with white's knight jumping onto b6, potential capture on f6 if you think about going on the left side of the board. Nodirbek wants none of that. He wants to develop his pieces, keep the activity going rather than getting greedy.
I didn't love his move. He developed his light-scored bishop, but it was attacking a pawn that was easy to defend. I would have preferred bringing that light-scored bishop out a little further, maybe to a square like f5. But I think that pawn on a3, it was capturable, not by the knight, because that would have handed white the b6 square, and that looks very ugly as black is super cramped, and white is definitely going to win back some material. But he could take it with the bishop, but that's neither here nor there. At this stage of the game, he probably didn't like how discombobulated his pieces look. Instead, he's playing with that isolated queen pawn. It protects both knights in the center. He's using it as a lever.
Yeah, and look at these two black knights. They are beautiful pieces. They are glorious pieces. But actually, what are they attacking? They're not creating any threats right now. Black will try to activate the rooks, but actually it's just hard to see what next. So Nodirbek, he's going for stability. Then again, he has moved this bishop twice. He's kind of done a shimmy step here to d7 and then to e6. I think Wesley should be feeling positive about this change in developments. Suddenly, rather than being down a pawn with white, he has a very playable position. Yes, he has given the opponent squares, especially the black knights, but white has squares too. These knights compensated for by this rock-solid bishop, this powerful bishop in the middle of the board, looking at both flanks. And I think this one still in the balance, and the clock could play a key factor. Nodirbek. Interesting, maybe a bit of indecision there. It was so tempted to grab a pawn. Wesley trying to shut things down, or at least trade off one of the sets of knights. Interesting move there, a retreat.
I like it because he's getting rid of his own knight on the edge for a knight that's extremely active, so definitely a trade that will favor white. Also, if it's done on Wesley's turn, a knight takes knight, the queen does fall back, recapturing, and then there'll be suddenly attacks along the diagonal with the queen and the bishop lining up. So wondering if Nodirbek will decide to just keep the tension on the board, keep that knight on c4, let Wesley trade it, sort out your problems of the isolated queen's pawn that way.
A lesson we learn when playing with the isolated queen pawn, we typically do not want endgames. The fewer pieces that remain, the harder it is for the side with the isolated queen pawn because we want to be active around that pawn. So I would not be taking on b2 if we're going to trade. Black should trade on his terms. Maybe rook c8, that way his rook can join the party on the c4 square. But Nodirbek, he's down under 6 minutes, so we're looking at the move 18, 42 moves before you get that 1 second bonus time. These are not easy decisions for him to make. I also wouldn't be surprised if he drops his knight back to d6 because the knight on b2, it's not the best piece in the world. And that knight on d6 can reroute to the f5 square and maybe keep posing some important questions in the center.
He does drop back as you recommend, Robert, but the move itself is secondary. That was a long think, 1.5 minutes on the clock in Armageddon as black. That's a huge chunk, a huge proportion of your time. And yeah, that might come back to haunt him. It will get fast and furious sooner rather than later. So I'm wondering whether that time was better spent just choosing a move, trusting his instinct. It feels like he's not quite in the flow yet. Neither player actually kind of unleashing this quick flurry of moves, trusting their instincts. But OK, it was a good decision in the end, keeping pieces on the board. It's just same move faster would have been better, of course. But Wesley So now up to him. He would love to just push the white a pawn 1 square forward, solidify the queen side, not kind of be too loose over that flank anymore. But maybe he thinks there are more urgent priorities in the position.
One of the priorities that I see for black would be to try and get rid of that dark squared bishop. That bishop on d4 to me looks like such a strong piece, taking away so many key squares. And he does it. I was thinking about the bishop move to f6, but Nodirbek finds another way. He reroutes that knight from c4 to attack that bishop on f4. Knight jumps over to f5. None of the pieces have been traded off. There's so much tension along the d line as well. It's those positions where it's really brewing up to explode. And with 5.5 minutes on the clock, things are going to get very tricky for Nodirbek.
I do like Wesley's last move, though. He's giving up his dark square bishop, which looked like the pride and joy of his position, but a knight that was on the rim on a4, it's wheeled right back around to d3. That can jump to f4, putting pressure on the light square bishop and that isolated queen pawn. So look at Nodirbek. He's not taking that bishop. There's no real rush. Yes, the bishop can slide back, but that doesn't solve all of White's problems. So both players are handling this position extremely well.
Yeah, really classy game so far from both. They've navigated those critical moments, those tricky decisions really, really well. But now Black's rook occupies this powerful open line. The c-file right now is ripe. There's plenty of squares for the rook to jump into. So it does feel like Wesley should challenge, fight for the open lines. Maybe he's just afraid of these exchanges, knowing he needs to win at all costs with White. But it feels like the moment to be objective, just challenge. There we go. He activates his rook. And how will Black continue the momentum? Maybe it's time for the Black queen to move. When do you trade off that bishop in the center? Big question still.
And Wesley, he made the move rook to c1, and with a shake of his head, every piece trade makes his task a little more difficult to try and create those chances that he needs with the white pieces in the Armageddon. A must-win game for Wesley. So rook c1 played, but I'm getting worried for Nodirbek. He's spending so much time on the clock. Now he's under 5 minutes, and there's still a long way to go before the position clarifies.
He's a speed demon, but he is getting quite low on the clock, especially that considering he has 39 moves to make to get that extra time. He goes queen d6. Talking about trades, queen a3. That's a pretty clever idea to get those queens off the board. And without queens, maybe, just maybe, Nodirbek's feeling comfortable and that he can play the next moves quite quickly.
Really, really nice move, but that one was a slow one. I think you're right, Robert. He at least has a clear-cut plan now, and that's the main thing in Armageddon. No matter how bad your position is, no matter how bad your plan is, as long as you're consistent and you have an idea in mind, it allows you to play quite quickly, allows you to get a flurry of moves in. And I know that these days a lot of younger players very rarely play without increment, but this is where the speed really is necessary. And I'm shocked. I thought the Black queen was coming in, trade off the queens. But no, Nodirbek wants to peer down at the white king. The Black queen is on the same diagonal as White's king, making Wesley feel slightly uncomfortable here. Actually, the more I look at it, the more I like this move. Really ambitious from Nodirbek.
Not only making him feel uncomfortable on the king side, but that queen on the queen side as well, because there is a threat of the d-pawn moving forward to d4 and x-raying that queen with that bishop on e6. And if that pawn was to move forward, suddenly from becoming a weakness, it starts becoming a strength in Black's position.
And that knight on f5 is actually such a heroic piece because not only did it kick that bishop out of the center, it protects the g7 pawn. So if White does slide the queen back to b2, and that's played right now, it doesn't carry a threat. So I think that trade is the name of the game. Bishop d6, let's trade off those dark square bishops. And Black does have a firm command over the queen side, and the king side does feel well defended as well.
Look at Wesley on the camera. He's getting ready. He's flexing. He's just trying to get in the optimal position for the imminent time scramble. It's 7 minutes against 4 minutes, essentially. Still a 3-minute time advantage, half what it was at the beginning of the game, but enough to cause some delight for Wesley. So I think he's going to start hustling on the clock. You can see on his body language, he's itching to make moves. And Nodirbek is still freezing. It's been 3 or 4 of these moments where he spent 30 seconds, 1 minute, 1.5 minutes. You don't have that luxury in Armageddon chess. Whatever your move, trade off the dark square bishops like Robert says, push pawns, trade off rooks, whatever. You've got to move quickly.
The more pieces on the board, the more calculation-based the position becomes. And with seconds on the clock, you have to rely on intuition. You have to play faster instinctively. But right now, if Nodirbek keeps continuing to keep these many minor pieces on the board, that's going to be a tough task. Bishop to d6, trade off that monstrous bishop on e5. He keeps thinking, and now he's touching the 3-minute mark.
He must be getting nervous right now because there's so many options. He does go for a bishop trade. The e-file bar actually slightly goes up in White's favor. I like the decision. I don't like the time it took to get there. So for Wesley, he now has just under 7 minutes. He's well ahead in the clock. Here's a moment where he has several different options. Just don't blunder your f2 pawn because the most tempting move in the position for White is going knight from d3 out to f4, but that will drop your f2 pawn. So just be careful if you're Wesley. No game-ending blunders.
Yeah, maybe trade off bishops first and then that move, Robert. It looks like Wesley has to part with his dark squared bishop, that beautiful bishop of White's in the center of the board, but he can do some dancing with his knights, and the nerves are definitely kicking in. Wesley occasionally is looking off at the clock already this early in the game. It's only move 23. He does trade off the bishops, and now the white knights. Do they start rolling? Do they start entering the center? Knight to f4 looks beautiful, putting pressure on that black isolated pawn, reminding Abdusattorov that he took on the isolated queen's pawn. No, he drops back. A bit of a counterintuitive move. retreating when it wasn't necessary. He wants to stop Black's knight getting back into the center where it previously stood strong.
Yeah, and that kind of really throws the ball on Nodirbek's court because knight e4 would have been an obvious move, but suddenly he has to slow down. Now he puts his own knight. There's a big threat on the board. He has to take care of this. Knight takes pawn, coming in with a fork. And you see how Nodirbek just leaned forward when he was making this move, knight to d4, so looking for that piece activity.
It's super complicated because white can bring his own knight to f4, which defends the e2 pawn, but then you need to calculate the moves like g5. So things are getting spicy. Wesley calculates things quickly, or he just wanted to play for Nodirbek's time trial. Nodirbek's about to go under 3 minutes. G5 is incredibly tempting, but it likely does not work.
Yeah, white can just counterattack, I think, here against the black knight. And yes, pawn's pieces will get traded, but the black king would become open. So this didn't happen. Bishop to g4 instead. There's pressure. There's threats on Wesley So. This pawn is attacked twice now. Nodirbek is trying to save time on the clock, force his opponent to waste time on the clock by going on the offensive. This is a good strategy in general. When the clocks are low, attack. It's much easier, quicker, instinctive to attack than defend. And look at this, contorting himself, Wesley So drops his knight back, clearing the second rank. The white queen now defending that row. But yeah, it looks a bit odd. Suddenly Wesley forced backwards.
When you need to win, you often want to avoid trades. But I think Wesley's going a little bit too far out of his way to avoid the trades. He's going backwards, but so is Nodirbek's clock. I mean, it's ticking down here. This is a problem for black. You're not even at move 30 yet, and you don't get that 1 second at a time per move until you get move 60. So, Tanya, I'm starting to like Wesley's chances.
100%. I mean, it's the clock and the position as well. There's this long-term weakness that you have with the isolated queen's pawn. Wesley's going to play this out till the very end, and you can fight against it. It'll always give white an edge unless black is able to create proper attack on that f2 square. Knight e4 is the move that you really want to make in this position, but white is just in time to block this diagonal with the move e3.
But Tanya, look at the clock. 30 seconds.
Make a move.
You've only got 2 minutes left. This is too slow.
And he's been so fast throughout the tour final, and then suddenly in this Armageddon with $50,000 on the line, a final spot on the line, Nodirbek, he needs to make a move.
Wow, he has spent nearly 50 seconds on this turn. He has less than 1 minute 45 remaining. Is he forgetting that there's no increment? Because he hasn't played Armageddon all day today. They played 6 games of rapid chess with 3 seconds bonus time per move. But he is just stalled. He's frozen.
This
it's
is
as
the
if
nerves.
He's physically incapable of making a move right now. What is he doing?
Why is he fiddling with pieces? You've got 1 and a bit minutes. 28 moves only. We're still miles away from the increment stage. He plays rook to d8, a passive defensive move, holding together black's isolated queen's pawn, but he needed to be consistent. Attack, go on the front foot when you're down on time. And now he's retreating. This is great news for Wesley So, terrible news for Abdusattorov. 1 minute 20, the key moments are still ahead. There's still so many pieces on the board.
And Wesley just makes the most natural moves now. It's easier for him to play. There is no attack on the e2 pawn, on the f2 pawn, and Wesley is going for that isolated queen's pawn. Trade on offer. Wesley takes the pawn.
The thing is, for Nodirbek, the moves are going to get easier because a bunch of trades are happening, but you're now just down material. So unfortunately for Nodirbek, he froze. He might be panicking internally, and now Wesley clearly has the upper hand.
Simple pawn up for white. No deficiencies to the white position. Just convert that extra pawn. He'll also be left with a bishop versus a knight with pawns on both flanks. He's going to reach for his bishop. He captures. Watch out for the black king. Vulnerable to some checks on the light squares. Nodirbek's position and clock situation both collapsing simultaneously. He drops his knight back, attacking the bishop, holding on. Good move. But look at that. He's panicking now. He looked over at the clock, realizing only 1 minute.
Oh my God, Nodirbek down to a minute, no increment, down a pawn. He needs a miracle to save this one. He rushes with the rook trade, and it's going to be all about combining the efforts of a queen and a knight, which can be quite dangerous and tricky against a queen and a bishop.
And Wesley, this rook on d1 that was just captured, he moves his bishop back out to b3. He needs to pile pressure on some of black's vulnerable pawns. So for Wesley right now, plenty of time on his clock. For Nodirbek, he's down under a minute.
He's down under a minute, and, OK, ignore the board. He did capture that black rook at the bottom on d1. It's now queen and bishop versus queen and knight. White is just a pawn up, so let's ignore that small board for now. Let's focus on the players, and it's all about whether Nodirbek can hold on. It's not going to be easy long-term, but he's got the move counter there. Look at the tablet, move 37. He needs to make 23 moves in just under 1 minute.
His chair is shaking. Like, you could see how nervous he is right now because he does not have time to calculate. He just put his G-pawn forward. So he's down a pawn. He's trying to make space for his king. Wesley doesn't immediately have threats. That's the one bit of good news for Nodirbek.
To be precise, he's got 48 seconds on the clock with no increment to be made. The good news for Nodirbek is that he's got the queen and knight. But how does the knight find itself? Find a good post into Wesley's camp right now? I don't see a clear path.
And what an angle we see, visibly nervous now, shaking. He's trying to get the adrenaline pumping. I think he's just trying to set up a fortress, erect that fortress on the dark squares. White only has a light squared bishop, so if you hold the opposite color complex, you might be able to fend off the attack. And, OK, we see a check, a quick repetition of the position. Wesley cannot draw. He cannot repeat a third time.
Of course he doesn't, but that gives extra moves to Nodirbek.
That was very helpful for Nodirbek, and the bad thing for Wesley is he doesn't have an eval bar at his disposal. He doesn't know that he is objectively winning. If the queens come off the board, can the knight establish a dark square blockade? That's the big question.
He's also dropped a second pawn. Can Wesley grab? He does take on b6, and now there's just one check. It was only one check. The white king's safe. If the queens come off now, it is dead. White is simply winning due to the 2 extra pawns, especially the protected pass pawn on b5. He can centralize now. I think this is going to kill the counterplay. Abdusattorov is on the brink of elimination.
And Wesley, he did the right thing. He gives a check to centralize his queen. He can bring his queen back to help shield his king, which is vulnerable in the second row. But he can even bring his queen back to its starting square. And he can trade pieces anytime, but this is even nicer. Going in for the kill.
Going in for the kill. Look at the light squares. The queen, the bishop lined up. A battery on the diagonal. White is threatening queen to f7 check next to the black king. That would be lights out. Black's queen forced to defend.
For Nodirbek, he's got no time as well and lost on the board. These are the final few seconds of Nodirbek in the Champions Chess Tour finals.
And the queen can take this knight. A new queen will appear, and I think that will cause resignation.
Nodirbek knows it. He resigns. Wesley So is into the finals.
What a game between these two, and you have to feel for the youngster. And look at Wesley. He finally can catch his breath. He's been exhausted. He's played for over 6 hours today, but he makes it through to tomorrow.